Ibn Khaldun was a 14th century Islamic historiographer, sociologist, economist, and philosopher. He is widely regarded as one of the most important intellectuals to have ever lived. Born in a turbulent time when the Moorish Caliphate in Iberia and North Africa was collapsing both from internal and external pressure, Ibn Khaldun set out to chronicle a sociology of the rise and fall of civilization. His so-called history, really a sociology, of the Arabs and Berbers, as well as North African civilization, was published in 7 volumes, in which it is the 3-volume introduction that has been the great legacy of Ibn Khaldun. The Muqaddimah, as it is remembered to posterity, was the first attempt to give a universal science, a universal sociology of history, of civilization. Ibn Khaldun continues the classical tradition of understanding humans as political animals, but also serves as the transfiguring prophet of modern political theory, providing for us the earliest accounts of the state of nature, individualism, and the process of social atomization. In beginning his work, Ibn Khaldun states, human social organization is necessary. Humans are not meant to live an unorganized, isolated, unpolitical, non-political life. Humans are, following what Aristotle said, political animals. And again, to this, Ibn Khaldun agrees. Thus, he is a continuation of that classical tradition of understanding humans as social animals. Since humans are social creatures, and sociality entails organization as humans encounter and engage one another, Ibn Khaldun's work sets out to explore and explain how humans, from their origins as individuals and families and tribes, eventually emerge as civilizations, and how these civilizations eventually decline and fall. Organization is born from this dialectic of encounter and engagement, and from that encounter and engagement, birth, apogee, and then eventually decline and destruction. Moreover, Ibn Khaldun gives a more practical and material reason for the human organization and formation of political life. The power of the individual, he says, is not sufficient for him to obtain the food he needs and does not provide him with as much as he requires to live. Unlike Hobbes and Locke, the competition for the scarcity of resources in the world doesn't keep men separated. True material self-interest, according to Ibn Khaldun, moves men into tribes and groups. It is not, as Hobbes and Locke say, that the conflict that other men have in the state of nature leads men to form political communities. It is the very self-interested rationalism and the material reality of geographic harshness and scarcity, the realities of general human existence, that moves men into political community. It is not man against man alone that moves humans into political organization, as in the pathetic Enlightenment mythology. It is man against nature that demands man to enter human organization and formation. By the very fact of our existence, the seed of society and civilization can be found. But Ibn Khaldun also foreshadows Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Locke when he gives a second reason for the formation of political life, the one thing that the crude Enlightenment mythologists and propagandists understood. As Ibn Khaldun says, aggressiveness is natural in living beings. Thus, Ibn Khaldun gives 2 accounts for why humans enter into society. One is the pragmatic, practical, material reality that our power as individuals is not sufficient to obtain the basic necessities of life, as well as defense against other aggressive human beings. As he says, aggressiveness is natural in living beings. Ibn Khaldun, therefore, does not take a starry-eyed view of the world and of human beings. In many respects, he is an Islamic version of St. Augustine, with his pessimistic realism, the understanding that aggressiveness and the lust to dominate is in fact natural in human beings. Humans are grounded with this insatiable lust for domination, not merely domination of the world, but domination of others. It is this lust to dominate, admittedly aimed at our self-comfort and happiness, that does produce the ultimate drive to society, to civilization. As Ibn Khaldun notes as part of his great irony, looking over human nature and civilization, it is in fact this lust to dominate that drives the most energetic and cooperative processes of human interaction and ultimately human civilization. For Ibn Khaldun, there are three principal reasons for the origins of political life. First, humans are political by nature, which drives them into relational bonds. And again, this is Ibn Khaldun taking the classical understanding of human nature and human society. We are social animals. And then, as just stated, his second and third reasons for why humans enter human society, civilization, and build civilization together is because of the harshness of the environment and the aggressiveness of other life forms. This coming together of humans to form political communities is the birth of civilization. The origins of the political is also identical, therefore, with the origins of a civilization. And as Ibn Khaldun stated earlier, organization is necessary. Therefore, political structures, laws, and offices are erected in civilization within political community as the law of organization, the very basis of human nature, demands. The organization of civilization, its laws, offices, and structures are all rooted in these three principles of socialization. The reality of humans being social animals, the reality of the harshness of environmental life, and the reality of the lust to dominate, the aggressiveness within human beings that is projected outward toward nature and toward others. Thus, you can see how laws attempt to foster the bonds of social reality, for instance, through marriage, through recognition of family rights, properties, and laws. You also see how economic laws, property laws, emerge as a reflection of the harsh environment that we find ourselves in. And you also see juridical law as a response to the aggressiveness, the innate aggressiveness in human beings. There is no such thing, therefore, as an apolitical animal. Humans are the political animal par excellence. It is in the origin and trajectory of political life, therefore, that Ibn Khaldun will discover the great irony of the political, as he lays it out in the Muqaddimah throughout his assessment of the rise and fall of civilization. The very success of civilization will actually prove to be its downfall. Ibn Khaldun, therefore, sits in a league with a few select other thinkers in the world of geopolitical theory. Geography is very much at the heart of Ibn Khaldun's thinking, and humans, as creatures in the world, cannot escape this reality as a being in the world. This is what makes Ibn Khaldun such a modern thinker, despite having lived over 700 years ago. Ibn Khaldun is a geographic determinist. As such, humanity's being and political life is determined like any other organism in the world. And like the diversity of life on Earth, human life is diversified through its environmental influences. But that doesn't do anything in altering the life cycles that human civilizations will experience. Ibn Khaldun asserts all life forms have built-in, predetermined life stages. Every plant has a life cycle. However, life forms adapt and grow based on their environmental surroundings. This is also true when you look at plant life and animal life. Human beings, therefore, mirror and adapt to the environmental conditions they find themselves in like any other life organism and life form. And just like how every other life organism and life form has its cycles of life, so too do human beings. As Ibn Khaldun observes, the history of political life is one in which human civilizations have arisen and remain founded near water. Water is the necessity, is the very necessary building block for life. This is true in all environments that humans find themselves in. Even in the most barren desert environments, humans will exist by water. It is in the watery areas of our environment, whether the luscious plain with the river or the oasis in the desert, that human society and civilization begins to emerge. As humans settle cities and eventually transition away from nomadic and rural life, they do so remaining in the water areas for the purposes of their agricultural economy. It is not the case that agricultural life and agrarian life is antithetical to urban life. There is no rural-urban divide as we like to think of it today. Rather, Ibn Khaldun understands that they are intimately related together. The original formation of human society by water produces the agricultural and agrarian life. Rural life starts first because, again, it's just a few people coming together. But out of that agricultural and agrarian life, from the rural farmstead, will eventually emerge the taming of nature and the formation of urban civilization. Urban life grows out of agricultural and rural life. And while there will always remain a certain dialectic, a contest between urban and rural, between those who try to adhere to the traditions of agricultural life against those who are embracing the new urban life, this contest between the two is not because they are necessarily mutually opposed, it is that they are intimately intertwined together. Urban life cannot come about without the agricultural and rural life that came first. Given the reality of humans as beings in the world, Ibn Khaldun understands human biodiversity through what scientists and other scholars call environmental conditioning. Environmental conditioning is the view that, over the course of time, life forms acclimate themselves to their environments. They adapt to the environments that they find themselves in. Human behavior and organization will differ based on their environmental dwelling. Differences in behaviors, laws, customs, and other conventions are based not on different gods or different understandings of the good, but based on the environments that humans find themselves inhabiting and cultivating life within. The role of the environment in shaping humans and civilization is so pronounced that Ibn Khaldun goes on to state that we might consider the obvious, but which was, in his time, not obvious at all. The fertility of land leads to a multiplication of civilizations. In the most fertile environments, multiple civilizations will arise, and they will fight it out for power and domination over each other. Take the Nile, the Fertile Crescent, or the Indus River and the Yellow River as the most obvious examples to us living today. Early human civilizations were river-based in the great river valleys of the world, precisely because they were environmentally suitable biomes to live in, to develop. Arid lands lead to very few civilizations, if any, because of the harsh scarcity of usable resources to sustain human life. And the people who occupy such places often remain in a state of primordial existence. In arid lands where single empires formed, like with the Mali Empire along the Niger River, that is the result of a few tribes that eventually get overwhelmed by the most dominant tribe, which forms the single empire in relative isolation because there were few human tribes to begin with. There were not many, and therefore whichever tribe comes to dominate will form the imperium in that scarce area. Meanwhile, in those areas, in the environments where we have the great fertility and flourishing of the land, which provides the basis for the multiplicity of civilizations, you find not only greater complexity, but a greater amount of war, contest between these civilizations, which produce the network of alliances, the coming together, the formation of new states against old states, etc., which drive the advancement of human civilization forward. However, eventually, these human civilizations will decline. They will decline not just because of war, they will also decline because of the environments that they are in. Societies that become accustomed to the wealth of their environment grow soft and weak. And when that lush, fertile environment is stripped away from them, either from environmental catastrophe or the loss of that land from an invading power, the decline of a civilization begins to set in. Wealth, which springs from successful domination of nature, also impacts political society. A virtuous people are not, intrinsically, virtuous. Virtue is something that matters, but ultimately something that matures in time. And because it matures, it also dissipates over time. Ibn Khaldun does not believe virtue is something intrinsic in human beings. Rather, it is something that is learned. It is something that grows. It is something that matures. Now, of course, he thinks virtue is very important and that virtue matters. But he also recognizes that virtue, because it is a product of human life, human civilization, virtue itself will also follow a life cycle. Virtue has the importance of providing what he calls, in his most famous contribution to human sociology and politics, Asabiyyah, what most translators call group feeling or intimacy. We might also understand it as a sense of social solidarity. As Ibn Khaldun states, respect for blood ties is something natural among men, with the rarest exceptions. It leads to affections for one's relations and blood relatives. That feeling is that no harm ought to befall them, nor any destruction upon them. And this is the basis of group feeling. Group feeling, group love, group solidarity first emerges in the family, and then it extends outward to your cousins, your other members of your family, and then it extends outward to the tribe, and then from the tribe to your community, and from the community to your nation, etc., etc. However, wealth corrupts virtue and disintegrates group feeling and leads to the process of atomization, individualism, and hedonistic self-interest. No virtuous people can avoid this fact of life. Life cycles will always follow this trend. The emergence of a society is in group feeling, and this is what gives a people their strength. But eventually, the wealth they obtain, whether it's through the conquest of nature or the conquest of other societies, will make them weak. Those bonds that once led them to self-sacrifice for others will lead to their own hedonistic individualism and self-interest. And in the emergence of that wealth, which produces hedonism and self-interest, the bonds of society decay and fray, making civilization weak. But as these civilizations weaken, there are other civilizations emerging at the same time. There is always old and young, new and old. Just because one civilization has been around for a while doesn't mean it's the only civilization. A new civilization, new society, new peoples are always emerging. And thus you have the repeat of this conflict of Asabiyyah, of the solidarity between a dying people and a rising people, an emerging society and a declining society, an old civilization and a new civilization. Furthermore, not everybody within a civilization will share equally in the luxurious life. As such, a civilization is also weakened from the wealth disparity that emerges from within. There are going to be people within a society, Ibn Khaldun notes, that are suffering, that they lack luxury, that they are not as wealthy as their mostly urban counterparts. And thus these people, in their suffering, generally living in the more rural regions of a society, will retain a greater feeling. They will retain that group feeling longer and more powerfully than their decadent urban neighbors, who come to shun their past and see those rural dwellers as savages. And thus a society begins to decay from within. The people who are willing to continue sacrificing versus those who are not willing to sacrifice will eventually be overrun by a new civilization, a new people coming into their land. There is, of course, a tragic irony in all of this. Ibn Khaldun notes that one of the reasons for civilization and the eventual settlement of cities, rather than living in small rural communities with few networks or nomadic lives to enjoy, was the fact that our very nature is spurring us to the domination, the conquest of nature, the domination and the conquest of others. We are constantly seeking more and more and more. And this, of course, is the growth phase of a civilization. But once we obtain what we are desiring, we reach a stagnant phase in human life and society. This is when luxury and wealth and hedonism set in. We are no longer willing to struggle and sacrifice with one another. We become highly atomized and individualistic. And this frays and destroys the bonds of society. And this leads to the slow death and decline cycle, wherein a new people, a new society, a new civilization will emerge to overtake the older civilization as it dies. But that new civilization that is emerging is also following the same trajectory. They are moved by a willingness to sacrifice for each other. They are moved by that asabiyyah, that group solidarity, which will allow them to triumph over the older, more technologically advanced civilization, which will collapse from the weight of the new emerging civilization. But they too will eventually become corrupted by the wealth they obtain. They will stagnate and eventually move into a decline and death, and a new civilization will emerge and replace it, so on and so forth. However, it is the very success of human nature, that desire to conquer, that desire to obtain, that proves to be its own downfall. All of these civilizations will descend to their death precisely because of their success. The disintegration of society is marked by the excessive luxury among a small segment of the population which had benefited from all the sacrifices from the people who came before it. The very drive to dominate, the very drive to transform nature, to transform ourselves, will prove to be our very downfall. And so life repeats itself, and new civilizations rise and old civilizations fall. The cycle of life starts anew. There is nothing new under the sun, after all. But Ibn Khaldun and his Muqaddimah remains one of the greatest works of sociology, philosophy, and shrewd assessments of human nature ever written. To summarize Ibn Khaldun in the most succinct manner, Ibn Khaldun understands that human nature is moved by sociality, and thus it is a combination of our innate social nature, our finding ourselves in environmental realities of scarcity, as well as the aggressiveness of other life that pushes us into society, and it drives the formation of human society. In this formation of human society, we eventually tame, conquer, and transform nature. We will also even conquer other tribes, other people. We will obtain wealth through the great sacrifices that we make for each other in this movement, in this growth of civilization. But the great success that we find in our sacrifices, in our willingness to change and transform nature, our use of technology, our domination of others, will lead to our downfall, because this brings in the onset of great wealth and luxury, which frays the bonds between people. That group solidarity, that group feeling that led us to sacrifice so much, now leads to individualism, hedonism, and nihilism. Decline sets in. But all decline isn't the same, because other tribes, other families, other groups of people, other societies, other civilizations are not in their decline phase, just like how different plants are in different stages of their life phase. Thus, when an old society and an old civilization has reached that moment of stagnation, when wealth and luxury and hedonism has set in, when all the bonds and the willingness to sacrifice for others have dissipated, a new people emerge, and the old civilization dies, and the new civilization emerges. Ibn Khaldun provides an environmental, geopolitical, and ultimately cyclical account of human civilization. And many of us who will read Ibn Khaldun for the first time will find a very prescient and modern man, even though he lived in the 14th century. Ibn Khaldun truly is one of the most important, insightful, and prescient thinkers to have ever lived. We, especially living in the West today, might find great resonance in the very things he observed in his own lifetime.